Hello and welcome to Talk Gnosis. I'm your host, Deacon Jonathan Stewart, and I am joined by special guest host. You know him from previous shows. It's Nic Lachetti. Hello, Nic.
Hey, everybody.
And we have a very special guest. Some fascinating work, really groundbreaking work, if you ask me. Really important, relevant, next level work. We have Dr. Nathan Bjorge with Talk Gnosis Theurgy project. Hello, Dr. Bjorge.
Hello. I represent a paradigm called liberation theurgy, and this is kind of a play on words with the more familiar liberation theology. So I'm trying to kind of mix and match with that paradigm a little bit. I'm mostly concerned with the use of critical theory, which is the polite word in academia for Marxist historicism, applied mostly to the context of neo-pagan theology. So the idea is to try to critique and examine the way that contemporary neo-paganism, which includes Wicca, but also particularly ceremonial magical traditions, which are my more specific focus, but some of which I have to say applies particularly to Wiccan practice as well. So I don't want to artificially exclude that category. And basically, contemporary neo-paganism reemerges as a religious tradition, as a mass movement, largely in the 1950s, although there's some earlier antecedents to that, particularly with the so-called Thelemic tradition represented by Aleister Crowley, which is the main focus of my work. And that begins much earlier in the 20th century. But as a widespread popular movement, neo-paganism really kind of explodes in the post-war period. And it starts out as a very radical movement focused on feminism in particular. But as it becomes more mainstream over the years, it's become increasingly conservative. And so what I'm trying to do in my work is kind of recover some of the initial more radical threads of interest in this type of discourse and push back against some of the class issues of reification that occurs in the community as older members of the community become more established economically and start to lose patience with the interests sometimes of younger members of the community interested in issues like trans inclusion or the legacy of colonialism with regards to inclusion issues in diversity, issues of race, class, and gender. And so I think that engagement with these issues should be really central to the concern of the neo-pagan community. Some of that has implications for larger discourse. I'm mostly in this conversation going to be focused on a neo-pagan context, but as we proceed, some of that comment will apply to a larger American, particularly context. I hope this will also be of interest internationally, but I am going to be mostly focused on issues in the United States right now. So that's sort of where I'm coming from and what my work is related to.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a really important conversation. I think you're doing really important work, particularly if you have that focus on neo-paganism, where, you know, there is talk that we are going through an occult revival. It is, if that's not true, then religion is certainly going through some interesting changes and mutations in the West. But for a lot of people, like if they're interested in the occult, or even now, if you're a young person, if you're interested in religion, that religion is often going to be some form of neo-paganism. So to have this kind of work as people, young people, as you mentioned, are streaming into this movements, the bodies of thought, I think is so needed. Before we do dive in, I will ruin the flow. Let me ruin the show for a sec by doing our commercial for our Patreon. We do need your financial support to present the show, to keep it going, and you can donate for as little as $1 per piece of media per month. And you can put a cap on that if you're scared we're going to do 1 million pieces of media. And those who have been following and watching closely have noticed we are doing more media. We're not running it all through the Patreon, but we're doing bonus shows. And Father Tony, our founder, is doing many more live events. He's trying to do 4 or 5 live events a week is what he wants to work up to. So really exciting things happening. You can also do paypal.com/Gnostic if you want to do a one-time donation. And share the show, tell people about it, share it on your social media, give it a good good review, especially on Apple Podcasts, where the Archons left us some bad reviews. 5-star ratings. Just take a show and email it to someone that you know. Email them this show because they'll appreciate it. Okay, Dr. Bjorge. Bjorge. So you talked a little bit about why you started the Liberation Theurgy project, and you mentioned that the project is in many ways has a focus on neo-paganism, but also it does touch on Thelema. What is your background and your connection to Thelema?
Sure. I've been involved in the community for about 25 years now. Since 1996, I was initially initiated into the Thelemic tradition. And this occurred in Berkeley, in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. And in that context, the Wiccan and ceremonial magical communities are very interwoven. And so they're not really fundamentally distinct from each other. And this was particularly more evident in the 90s when I was involved, where in the kind of earlier period of the 70s and 80s, there'd been a little bit more kind of need to differentiate the brand names between the two different sort of flavors. But the impulse to need to do that had kind of faded a little bit, and it's really a kind of linked community. Basically, historically, contemporary neo-paganism really does derive, it emerges out of a kind of theosophical context. If we were having this conversation 100 years ago, it would be theosophy rather than neo-paganism that would be the primary cultural paradigm. Yeah. But after the Second World War, theosophy kind of fades away and neo-paganism emerges as the primary cultural paradigm. Now, the primary originator of that is the work of Aleister Crowley, and his philosophy is called Thelema, and I practice that tradition. I practice ceremonial magic, and I also focus primarily on a perspective on neo-paganism that's informed by Thelemic philosophy. Mm-hmm. Now, when Gerald Gardner emerges in the 1950s as in promoting Wicca as its own particular flavor, he did know Crowley and kind of got a lot of the ideas to get the ball rolling with that from the writings of Aleister Crowley. But for a long time, Wicca wanted to try to differentiate itself from Thelema. Yes. And more recently, maybe in the last 20 years, that particular need has kind of faded. And I think most Wiccans today would acknowledge that Crowley is kind of a primary forebearer to Gerald Gardner. Part of the reason for this relates to what Harold Bloom calls the anxiety of influence, which is that when you're a strong creator and you're promoting your own set of ideas, which is what Gerald Gardner was doing, was launching Wicca, you want to underplay the influence that is coming into your field of interest from major preceding figures. You want to kind of rebrand or promote what you're doing as maybe more original than it actually is. And so particularly when Wicca was establishing itself in the 70s and 80s, it wanted to promote the idea that it was less related to Crowley's ideas than really it was. But as time goes on and Wicca becomes more and more established and kind of just taken for granted in the larger cultural scene, the need to disavow the influence from Crowley kind of becomes less urgent. And so there's more openness to acknowledging that as a primary influence. So while I'm mostly going to be talking about Thelema and Crowley, this does in fact relate to Wicca and other forms of ceremonial magical traditions, or what you could call witchcraft. So just keep that in mind as I'm usually framing things in a Thelemic way, but they're going to relate to this larger context of influence as well. I began working particularly on liberation theurgy when I was completing my doctoral degree at the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. I finished my doctorate in 2017, and my thesis work in particular had the moniker liberation theurgy as how I wanted to kind of identify what I was doing. And so I worked hard in that period to kind of work out the particular methodology, criteria, and theory of what I'm trying to promote. And in particular, I'm trying to push back against what I see as a kind of reabsorption of what was originally a more radical paradigm. And it becomes increasingly commodified over time and gets reabsorbed back into the larger set of assumptions in liberal consensus society in terms of what you're supposed to be doing when you're doing a scene or thing, or you're having a paradigm, and certain values or expectations that come from marketing, or from the idea that you're going to treat your community as a bunch of customers rather than as a place where you could challenge the larger set of assumptions in, the larger society. These factors all begin to come into play. And so then it becomes necessary at a certain point, when the initial sort of radical impetus of a tradition starts to exhaust itself, you have to reassess and go back and try to re-engage with the original kind of root or source of what you're trying to do. And so that's what I've been trying to do with Liberation Theurgy. The YouTube channel that I have, which is also under the name of Liberation Theurgy, you can just look it up on YouTube, type it in. I got that started more recently, in fact, during the quarantine. And I was involved for a number of years with an independent Thelemic temple called Temple Sophia, Babylon, Caledonia, which also has a Facebook page, which you can watch some of our masses, where we were performing the Gnostic Mass as a public event, separate from other organized venues for this. And when the quarantine started, it became clear that we weren't going to be able to have public events anymore. So I started to put some of my stuff up in the video format at that point, and try to become visible a little bit more on the internet. Subsequently, the main priestess of the temple that was my main partner in that, a person by the name of Carrie Sealine, she unfortunately passed away of cancer last October. And so we've had to kind of have the temple go dark, although we hope to reopen it in a new context at some point in the near future. In the meantime, I'm available to promote my own ideas, and so here I am.
Yeah. So if we could stay with Thelema for a moment, and maybe some of this could possibly be applied to Wicca, you can let me know, because sometimes I do feel that the Wicca, as well as other forms of neo-paganism, can be very individualist. But, I would say a very common stereotype about Thelema, and maybe, Nic, you can talk about this too after Dr. Bjorge answers. But a lot of people have an impression that Crowley and his system is like sort of a proto-Ayn Rand. It's an ideology of extreme individualism. People here do what thou wilt, and believe that it is sort of a right-wing libertarian ideology. This is a very common belief, very common idea I find when I'm talking to people. So is this true, and wouldn't this contradict any of these sort of liberation theology ideas and liberation theurgical ideas that you're working with and applying in these contexts?
Well, it's not true that this is a common misreading of Crowley. I would say that this is similar to the traditional conservative misreading of Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, who is often also there's an attempted appropriation of his ideas, and has been historically for a very long time, by conservatives. This is fundamentally a misreading of Nietzsche's work, and I would also argue that the right-wing reading of Crowley is fundamentally also a misreading of Crowley. So contemporary right-wing conservatism is a form of liberalism. And I would actually argue that the primary ideology that Crowley is concerned to criticize is in fact bourgeois liberalism. And he's concerned as a queer man to criticize the bourgeois social norms that restricted his freedom of social and particularly sexual expression. So just because he made it clear that he was hostile to both fascism and also to Stalinism, this does not automatically make him a liberal. And I think that this is a persistent misreading, particularly of what he means by individualism. So conservatives will want to claim that they have a kind of exclusive right to define the natural definitions of terms like individualism, liberty, freedom, things like that. These terms all have a much more complex, diverse meaning in various different political philosophies. Conservatives are going to want to say the definition that we have of these terms is the correct natural definition. Well, actually, there is no natural definition of these terms. They all have a historical, contextual meaning that can vary depending on the context. Crowley makes it quite clear that his concept of individuality, he is an individualist just like Friedrich Nietzsche is a social concept of individuality. So, for example, let me give you some citations. In his essay, Duty, that's the title of this essay, you can look it up. Crowley enumerates, quote, the chief rules of practical conduct to be observed by those who accept the law of Thelema. The law of Thelema is do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. So under the heading of what he calls your duty to yourself, he includes the following exhortations. Contemplate your own nature. Consider every element thereof, both separately and in relation to all the rest, so as to judge accurately the true purpose of the totality of your being. So this implies that individuality has to be considered both separately, but also relationally. You have to balance out these two components. If you're just focused on what you can get as a private bourgeois individual in the way that that appears in commodity society, you're actually ultimately limiting what your individuality can potentially be. Let me give you another citation, just so I have more than one text that demonstrates this is Crowley's notion of individuality. In the famous introduction to Magic and Theory and Practice, one of his most well-known works, he has a number of theorems of magic. The most famous one is that magic is defined as the science of, and art of causing change to in conformity with will. But that's only one of the definitions. He's got, in fact, 28 definitions of or theorems of magic. The seventh theorem of magic is that every man and every woman has a course depending partly on the self and partly on the environment, which is natural and necessary for each. Anyone who is forced from their own course, either through not understanding themselves or through external opposition, comes into conflict with the order of the universe and suffers accordingly. So again, we have this notion that you have to balance out the factor of environment and the self, and that the difference between these two is in fact perhaps very radically fluid. Now, also we have to keep in mind what the ultimate definition of the self is for Crowley in terms of his magical ontology, if you will. Now, in traditional Christian organic hierarchical notions of metaphysics, the ultimate nature of reality is defined as a kind of metaphysical unity. So there's a kind of ultimate one, maybe that's God, the monotheistic deity, or that could be the national state, or it could be the Volk or the people. And then there's a kind of hierarchy that's established by your relation to that ultimate unity. And so this is the ultimately conservative notion of how the world is supposed to be organized. Probably the best example of this would be Julius Evola, his notion that the tradition, as he calls it, involves that you're supposed to have a kind of organic hierarchy of being, and everything's supposed to be related to this, and everybody's supposed to know what their place is, and masters are supposed to be masters, and slaves are supposed to be slaves. And Crowley is concerned to explode all these notions of metaphysical unity by instead having his absolute as what he calls the Kabbalistic zero, or a kind of ultimate nothingness, which is a kind of openness where you can really be whatever you can make yourself to be, in a kind of anarchy of being. So an individuality conceived in those terms is a kind of anarchic notion of self that is not conformable to an organic hierarchical notion of individuality. And so although Crowley and libertarian conservatives will both use this term individuality to describe what they're about, what that means is radically different, and in fact not compatible between these two modes of thought. And I think a lot of people who read Crowley, they see the language of liberty or individuality or freedom, which is certainly language that he uses. And because they've inherited, usually from a Christian background, a notion of a kind of organic hierarchicalism, or a kind of ultimate notion of unity is what you're supposed to spiritually be seeking for, that they miss that Crowley, because he has a different notion of the absolute, is on a different track with these terminologies, that there's been a kind of what Nietzsche calls a transvaluation of values. So that he may be using some of the same words as traditional mysticism or spirituality, but all these terms mean something very different in Thelemic philosophy that isn't conformable to a more traditional conservative notion of spirituality. I don't know if, Nick, do you want to add to this or say anything about this?
So maybe not, this is a little jumping the gun on our question list, but it seems appropriate at this moment. So one of the things that I was really thought was great in what you're saying is you know, and is in your dissertation, is the relationship between dialectics and Thelema, and then using dialectical materialism to interpret Thelema, to do the reading that you're doing. And I felt when you were just speaking that, you know, part of this misunderstanding that Crowley is either should be interpreted through like a liberal paradigm or even a traditionalist paradigm. So you mentioned Evola, is this idea that there is this ontological essence that's static in some way. But whereas a dialectical worldview, maybe you could kind of give us a summary of some of how you're using dialectical materialism, is that really the world is in flux, and there's no solid kind of ontological essence that, you know, you're sussing out, and then you have to live in that organic way, you know, in like a hierarchy or something, but actually everything's moving. So yeah, I see that in Thelema a lot, but I don't feel like anyone besides your work, I actually hadn't seen people draw that out much.
Sure. Well, a lot of my work emerges out of the context of the Thelema community in Berkeley over the last few decades, which has a lot of connections to the counterculture movement, the 60s and 70s, and has this kind of radical core to it. And of course, that's diversely interpreted. Back to the point to your point, Nick, the concept of the Kabbalistic zero in Crowley, another way that he defines this is what he calls zero to the zero power. So what that means is that if you have a concept of nothingness as your absolute, for that nothingness to actually be absolutely nothing, it would also have to negate itself. So in other words, you would have to have something, namely the cosmic reality that we find ourselves in. So, but there's a kind of trace of that ultimate ontological nothingness that persists within reality, in the sense that we can then dialectically characterize all phenomenon as, in Buddhist terms, lacking an abiding essence. This is so the concept of a kind of nothingness as the ultimate ground of reality is something that Crowley does get from Buddhism, but he's kind of reintegrating that with the Western theurgic tradition. We'll perhaps have more to say about theurgy shortly. But basically the notion, I read zero to the zero power as a kind of self-negating nothingness is equivalent to Hegel's dialectical notion of the negation of negation. Now, we know that when Crowley was working on some of his philosophical papers where he formulated the idea of the Kabbalistic zero, particularly a very important paper from 1902 entitled Barshith, an Essay in Ontology, and that this informs some of the ideas that later appear in the Book of the Law. We know that he was reading Hegel's logic. And so I think that he's getting this notion of zero to the zero power, or the negativity that negates itself, actually very directly from a reading of Hegel's dialectic. Now, Hegel's notion of the dialectic is that For Hegel, the notion of essence, he uses the German word Wesen. In traditional metaphysics that derives from Plato and Aristotle, metaphysics consists of the idea that all existing phenomenon have a kind of internal essence that's internal to them, their form, in virtue of which their matter has cohesion as an event. Mm-hmm. Now, in Hegel's dialectic, he dialectically inverts that. And in his concept of essence, phenomenon are defined as having their essence outside of themselves, mm-hmm. not inside of themselves, but outside of themselves. In other words, it's the whole impact of the historical context of an event that gives it its meaning, structure, and form. So the form, in a way, comes from outside rather than from the inside. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that since everything comes from the outside and then inside, there is no kind of internal essence, but nevertheless, every phenomenon is a completely unique expression of how these external factors are relating to each other. And because there is no fundamental abiding ontological essence, freedom or Kantian autonomy, mm-hmm. Derived from Immanuel Kant's idea of autonomy, is the kind of ultimate horizon of Hegel's dialectic. Mm-hmm. Human beings in particular have a kind of existential freedom. The later existentialists pick this up from Hegel's dialectic as well. And so because things are not ultimately determined, we're free as human beings to make of ourselves what we will. How we perceive or posit ourselves then becomes who we are. And so we have to then become responsible for this kind of hermeneutical and framing that we're then, it's as if we're always producing a kind of virtual reality that Hegel calls spirit, that then is kind of the world that we find ourselves in. This is like what Heidegger calls being. It's this kind of enfolding hermeneutical horizon that's always being posited by human activity. Mm-hmm. But because it reverberates back upon us as a kind of apparently objective external object that we don't see how we're the active agents creating it, we lose sight of the fact that we're the ones who ultimately have agency. Mm-hmm. And we just get absorbed in what we assume to be this sort of given consensus reality. Mm-hmm. And so what magic then becomes about in a kind of dialectical sense is we have to regain our agency to more proactively reprogram ourselves. And magic is a way to use language, because language is a primary way that we construct the consensus reality that we find ourselves in, where our social identity is something that we inherit from the language usages that surround us as we're socialized in the particular culture or community that we grow up in. And so because that just happens to us, we then lose sight of the fact that we can then appropriate that language and then language ourselves more proactively. Mm-hmm. And so we use spells and magic as a kind of spelling to reappropriate the grammar of the culture that we're in, like grimoire, a magical book of spells that comes from the word grammar. So it's just another use of language. So rather than the consensus reality telling us through language that we're supposed to be a consumer who's supposed to go to work and have this particular social identity in terms of our assumed gender or whatever, instead we can spell out through the spells that we cast a new, potentially new, more liberative identity for ourselves. And this can be done individually or in community through a magical working group, where we can come together as magicians and potentially through a kind of neuro-linguistic programming, we can reprogram ourselves and create a kind of space between ourselves and consensus reality where some kind of free action becomes possible in a way that the larger consensus reality is always telling us that it isn't, that we just have to go to work, get paid, these are the products that we can buy, and then these are the entertainment sort of things that are available that then we're supposed to be fans of that then tell us who we are, whatever. We don't have to just be consumers. We can also create our own creative products ourselves. You know, we don't have to just read the stuff that's there. We can write our own novels. We can create our own narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think you explained really well what magic and spells are, but can you tell us
Theurgy.
what is theurgy?
Well, theurgy is a concept. Well, for starters, theurgy is basically the Greek word for magic, the ancient Greek word that just means what we would today call magic, particularly magic spelled with a K, Magick, like that. That's the way Crowley spelled magic, which is in fact just the older, modern, kind of Baroque way that magic was spelled in, say, the 18th century. That was just how the word was spelled. So theurgy is a concept of ceremonial ritual magic that is particularly philosophically developed in the 300s AD in the ancient Roman Empire. And there's a particular set of philosophers. This is called Neoplatonism. There's a revival of Platonism in the late Roman Empire. And there's several philosophers associated with this. The first is Plotinus. He's mostly concerned with mysticism. But then his successor, Iamblichus, gets interested in the way that ceremonial rituals, particularly rites of worship in pagan temples, can be used to so energize the soul to achieve a kind of union with the divine. The scholar of Neoplatonism, Gregory Shaw, in his classic 1990s work, Theurgy and the Soul, which is an excellent book on Iamblichus, highly recommended, he defines theurgy as a kind of demiurgy, another Greek word that just literally means God work, where you energize the soul to achieve union with the one, or the highest divine reality. Now, in a modern context, that divine reality is ultimately going to be identified with human existence. So it's not going to be a metaphysical transcendence beyond the cosmos. But some of the basic philosophical notions or procedures still apply. So, for example, in Neoplatonic theurgy, one of the things you're trying to do is to get into communication with a particular guardian spirit that's been assigned to you by the divine governance of the universe. There's this kind of magical hierarchy of beings, angels and gods and spirits. And that hierarchy has assigned to each person a particular guardian angel or spirit called the guardian daimon. Daimon, which later becomes the word demon, but that's misleading because in Greek, daimon just means any kind of spirit. So they're not necessarily, they could be evil, they could be good, they could be whatever. So each person has a particular guardian daimon. And when you basically have to develop your own magical cult where your personal daimon is the god that you're invoking. And then when you get into kind of communication with that daimon, you're then able to overcome the destiny that's imposed on you by the astrological influences that are determining your existence, and you can become what's called esoteric, which is the Greek word for liberty, meaning you're released from cosmic destiny, and your soul can then, particularly after your death, can reascend up into the heavens and have a more meritorious rebirth, where you might become a god or an angel or some kind of higher being that would not involve you being so enmeshed with matter, which is considered to be bad by Platonism. You're trying to liberate yourself from your soul's enmeshment in matter. So communication with this daimon is a way to do that. So fast forward to modern times, Aleister Crowley is then concerned in his practice of magic where you're trying to achieve what's called the knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel, which is basically the equivalent function, where this angel is basically a kind of higher and divine aspect of yourself. So you could say it's your higher and divine self, your highest, your best possible human potential. You have to kind of construct or conceive of that and then magically project yourself towards the realization of that. And there can be very spiritualistic kind of phenomenon that you might or might not have as part of that process. And this is how you actualize your ultimate potential for being, which is going to be different than what maybe the consensus reality that surrounds you is telling you is more limited. And so you're trying to release yourself from that and instead have a different kind of more freer existential self-projection. And so magic then becomes a way to do that. And so that links to these older Greco-Roman forms of theurgy. And so it's useful to look back on those earlier traditions to see ways that they can be influential on the modern tradition of magic. So again, that's a way to do that. Vic, did you want to say something?
Oh yeah. So one of the things that I really found fascinating about your dissertation is that there's a critique of Neoplatonism as an ideology of the ruling class, and I thought that was kind of very interesting, both in terms of the ancient world, but also, for me, one of the fascinating things about this, and in terms of modern paganism, is that Neoplatonism and kind of a popular Platonism is frequently undergirding people's assumptions about magic and the spiritual world. Even though I also have been through kind of a liberal Christian seminary setting, and there, Platonism usually is the theology of a pretty conservative and traditionalist form of theology, and not usually the kind of radical sort of theology that we've been talking about in terms of dialectics. So I'm just curious about if you could say more about that critique of Neoplatonism as this potential ideology of the ruling class, and how that comes into play in modern occult practice and kind of the reception of it. Yeah.
Well, a lot of this conservative set of ideas that are present in contemporary occultism derive in part, not exclusively, but in part from René Guénon's traditionalism, which reads what they claim to be the universal perennial tradition. I would argue that, in fact, there is no perennial tradition. There's just a diversity of different social practices that we choose to call religion, which may or may not be compatible with each other. But the notion, what they basically do is they read the diverse pluralistic traditions of religion in the past in terms of Platonism, where there's an ultimate divine principle that transcends the cosmos, and then there's a kind of cascading of stages of being that emanate out of that ultimate unity that then have a kind of hierarchy that you can climb back up to get back to the ultimate unity. So this is very much primarily a notion in Neoplatonism, for example, where you have what Lovelock calls the great chain of being, where you're trying to climb up this ladder of emanations back to the primary source of being. Now, basically, I read this in Marxist terms, where for Marx's philosophy of history, religious ideology always is a reflection of and a justification of the given class order of society or class structure of society. Basically, you take the given class structure and then you justify it by reading that into the supernatural reality. So in Neoplatonism, just as their culture is feudal and hierarchical, they see reality, ultimate reality, supernatural reality, undergirding reality, as feudal and hierarchical. So fast forward to modern times, part of the problem with liberalism, and now I'm talking about modern liberalism that we're all part of, whether we're liberal or conservative or whatever, it's all one overarching system of globalized capitalism, and there's diverse expressions of that, but it has a class system. And part of what liberalism does to neutralize people's ability to resist that class system is it tells people that there isn't really a class system. So one of the things that's so distinctive about modern liberalism is that we exist in a class society where one of the most important functions of ideology in that class system is to tell us that there's no ideology and that there's no class system. Meanwhile, we exist in a world where there's astronomical concentration of wealth in the bourgeois ownership class, and people are more and more who work for a living are more and more being proletarianized into kind of minimum wage shift gig labor positions, where they more and more don't have access to basic services like healthcare, food, environmentally coherent living conditions, and so forth and so on. So in the case of contemporary paganism, Platonism can be a valuable ideology to kind of assuage that the impact of class struggle by convincing yourself that, well, in this world, you may be on the verge of homelessness and at a job that you don't like, and this, that, or the other economic factors kind of controls your freedom. In the supernatural world that you have spiritualistic communication with through the gods or whatever, in that world, you're an enlightened or advanced magician where you've advanced up the hierarchy. So it's like in this world, you're not really part of the bourgeois class, or you might own your home and think of yourself as okay, but really you're not so okay. But you have this advanced magical grade. And so that makes it okay, because really in the magical world, you're this advanced adept or whatever.
Yeah.
And so, again, this is the function of ideology, to kind of confuse the issues so that you're not really engaging with what might be the more primary place that you should have your attention of your critical intelligence. And so as contemporary neo-paganism and Wicca and Thelema become more mainstream, the tendency is to have this kind of process of what you might call commodity reification, where the concepts and categories that are intended to liberate us instead become a way that they get reabsorbed back into the bourgeois set of norms and expectations. And we wind up using these systems of attainment to limit ourselves or justify our limitations rather than trying to critique and liberate ourselves from those. So Platonism can be Platonism can be a way to reconform yourself in that way. It can also be liberative. So, for example, I just want to point out that somebody who has a wonderful critique of Platonism is Slavoj Žižek, somebody that I use a lot in my thesis and in my work. And he points out that there's this kind of disavowed radical element also in Plato. So, for example, I just want to point out in Plato's Republic, it's gender egalitarian. Women and men can both be members of the guardian ruling class. The guardians in the Plato's Republic all have property in common, so they practice a kind of communism among themselves. It's based on merit. So there are classes in Plato's Republic, there's 3 of them, but which class you're part of is not determined by your birth or your economic status. It's determined by your merit. How well you're able to learn philosophy permits you to join the guardian class, as opposed to other factors. These are all radical egalitarian elements that are in Plato. So again, it's how you read it. So Platonism has these liberative elements, and it also has these conservative elements, and so does Neoplatonic theurgy. It just depends on how you read it. And so that's why hermeneutics, the strategy you have of interpretation, is so important in magical theory. You have to get clear about what angle you're looking at. What are the questions that you're asking? So that if you have kind of a liberative agenda, you can then find the bits and pieces in the texts and traditions that you're looking at that they are then conducive to that, as opposed to those who aren't. So, for example, Aleister Crowley comes from a bourgeois propertied class background. He tended to therefore identify with certain Tory cultural ideals, or at least ways of talking. Now, he doesn't ultimately identify with those ideals, but he's comfortable with having a certain type of personality in terms of his presentation, where he'll permit himself to sort of slip into those types of talking points or talk that way. Now, if you read him carefully, he's also kind of ironically, it's ironic. He's also kind of undermining that at the same time. He's kind of leading you on. But it's very easy for people of a conservative bent to read him, and he'll make racist jokes or whatever that in 1910 would be normal for people to make of his race and class, that today people would read and be like, oh, that means he's a racist like I am, and so then this justifies me having. Right. And they're not reading historically when they do that. They're not reading contextually and seeing the way that actually he wants to show people how they're not, in their ultimate essence, they're not a being that can be identified with their class or their race or their gender or their species or their whatever. All of these are are categories that the Kabbalistic zero, which is your ultimate kind of magical essence, a kind of non-essence essence, if you want to put it that way, ultimately permits you to transcend those limitations, but you have to work at it. And so particularly if you're a colonial, if you're a white person, or a white male in particular, particularly a white straight male, you're inheriting a lot of these ideological assumptions and elements that come from the legacy of colonialism. All of these are part of the old eon for Crowley.
Mm-hmm.
He posits that there's going to be this new eon where we're going to liberate ourselves from a whole bunch of stuff. Well, what are we liberating ourselves from? Well, we're liberating ourselves from sexism, from classism, from racism, from the legacy of the Christian colonial empires that used to control the world, but whose ideology, still like this sort of ghostly trace, still continues to insist in the world. And so if the idea of a new eon has any meaning at all, I think, it's that we need to identify these conservative elements and criticize and critique them. And then it's particularly important for those of us who are white, for those of us who are men, for those of us who are straight, for whether that does or doesn't apply to whoever's listening to this. But for those of us like myself, for whom all of those categories apply, we have to be proactive. We have to explicitly use magic, not just implicitly, but explicitly, to challenge and evaluate that we have to own our privilege or our entitlement. We can't just pretend that we can jump out of those assumptions. We have to own our location within that matrix of forces and try to find ways to be more flexible in terms of that. But that's a project. It's a very difficult struggle, and we need to engage with that as one of the basic challenges of what we're doing with our magical practice. But that means that we need to talk about race. We need to talk about class. We need to talk about gender, and not just assume that because, we deconverted from Christianity and became pagans, that's over and we don't have to worry about that anymore because we're cool now. That's not going to work. And so I think particularly in the last 20 years, but even before that, and especially now in the age of Trump, that it's becoming more and more of a challenge for the neo-pagan community, which is still very white, for example, to be able to effectively engage with these issues. That there's been a lot of entitlement issues over the last few years in the neo-pagan community, problems with trans inclusion, issues of that kind that are limiting the potential of what should be a more radical community. And so it's not enough just to assume that you're cool because you're part of what once was a radical tradition, but might not so much be so anymore. There's more work that needs to be done. And the first step of that is pedagogical, educational. We need to start talking about these issues rather than people getting upset when you raise these issues. So for example, to be more community specific, there's still a lot of issue with gender definitions in the neo-pagan community. What is a man? What is a woman? And so forth. And there's a tendency that is unexamined for a lot of people to have a kind of biological essentializing of these terms or definitions. I think it's very important to push and promote the idea that gender is a social construction that involves biological difference, not just having a given value to it, but that biology is radically interpretive. That just because your genitalia appear to be a certain way doesn't mean that you have any necessary relationship to any particular gender. That there's so many other multiple factors involved that the possible the diversity of sexual difference overwhelms any kind of biological essentialism that you could have. People are very uncomfortable still talking about this, and they want to relapse or disengage with these issues in a way that, and here Crowley's queerness becomes very valuable to have as a part of the conversation, not the last word, but as something that you can kind of put back into the conversation or insist on as a way to get people to question or be challenged with regards to whatever more heteronormative, cisnormative kinds of categories that they just take for granted. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, Crowley can be an ally because he's a kind of queer insurgent. And that's also another aspect of his discourse that kind of gets covered over by people who are straight, heterosexual, and don't really want to talk about or deal with that, and so they de-emphasize it. That's why I always try to emphasize it. And I find that that's especially important for me as a predominantly heterosexual person, that it also challenges me and whatever my expectations are, that I use Crowley as somebody who is different from me so that I can encounter that difference in his texts, so that I can be challenged by that.
Yeah. Actually, can we stay on this topic? Many in the occult and Gnostic world are re-examining language and ideas around gender, sexuality, sex magic, sexual tantra, right? Just like what you're talking about. But I noticed in your dissertation, you draw from the thought of Lacan. How can Lacan help us with these ideas?
Lacan's notion of sexual difference is a notion that is radically disconnected from any kind of biological notion of gender. Because Lacan is all about the way that language is the primary medium whereby human beings have their subjectivity and social shared reality constructed for them. And this occurs in terms of what he calls the symbolic order, which is basically just a way to say language. So Lacan is sometimes called a structuralist. That's just another fancy word for language. Structure, the symbolic order, it's all language. So what happens is that you have a cultural symbolic order, namely the language that you learn as you're being socialized as an adult, and that becomes internalized into you. And this is what Lacan calls the imaginary. It's the kind of base level matrix of the learned grammar and social roles that you learn from the larger linguistic usages in society. And that gets internalized, and then you are able to have a private experience of psychological interiority on the basis of the linguistic categories. The only reason that we're able to cognitively think in the way that we are as animals is because we have this particular practice that we have called language. And so when you think, you're always cognitively thinking in terms of linguistic categories. And this is the case even with when you have emotional experiences or whatever, and you think, oh no, that's a primary experience that I'm having before language is this emotion. No, when you have a particular emotion, that's just another linguistic signifier that you have that also has to be interpreted, that has some signification, that has some linguistic interpretation that you have to give it for it to then have meaning, or implicitly you're already interpreting it in terms of some linguistic set of categories. So all the experience that we can have is enfolded within this linguistically defined horizon, this hermeneutical horizon of what Heidegger would call being, which is not the same as physical reality. In fact, we don't have a unmediated ability to just encounter bare, objective physical reality. We don't encounter that. We always have this psychological experience through which that involve this linguistic grid of categories through which we're able to encounter, through a kind of metaphorical relationship, the objective shared reality that we are indeed part of. So what that means is categories like gender, class, all the different ideology associated with patriarchy, that these are bound up with the form of language that we learn, so that all of the linguistic categories we have that are already overdetermined in terms of already informed by these overarching ideologies like patriarchy, like heteronormative gender, and so forth, that means that we're already socialized into these categories. so that there's no ability for us to just naively use language in an objective way that would be free from these categories. So we have to engage with these sorts of enveloping concepts that have already been determining what we take to be objective reality, which turns out to be much more subjective than we think that it is, or I should say maybe intersubjective. So Lacan's theory of psychoanalysis is a powerful tool to use to understand the way that we're always already embedded in an ideologically rich context of language use that we need to be self-critical about. And so, so what that, in particular with gender, Lacan is very keen to show that the assumed status of the male normativity is radically socially constructed in a way that is ultimately unfulfillable, and self-defeating. And so Lacan's psychoanalysis is implicitly a criticism of patriarchy. In fact, what he's discovering is that Freudian psychoanalysis generally, what's called the Oedipal complex in psychoanalysis, is implicitly a criticism of patriarchy. What is the Oedipal complex? It's how we're messed up by our fathers who impose these patriarchal norms on us that traumatize us, all of us, whether we're male or female or intersex or whatever. And so it becomes the process of therapy is where, rather than just taking this trauma for granted, we back up and we re-examine the narrative of our socialization. We go back in our memory and we rediscover the way that we were made to assume that we had to have our personality or have certain social responses or our personality in a particular way that are not in fact given, that are not in fact natural at all. They're unnatural impositions of a linguistically imposed social ideology that is flexible, that's historically contingent, that isn't given, that's an illusion, that isn't given at all. And perhaps we can get some flexibility or deconstruct our need to just be defined in those terms. And so in particular, the work of Slavoj Žižek, again, a person that I use a lot in my own work, he defines what he calls dialectical materialism as a kind of merging of a certain type of post-Soviet Marxism with Lacanian psychoanalysis. And sort of those two things together, kind of Lacanian Marxism, are the methodology of what he calls, and what I also use and call, dialectical materialism. So maybe that's the usefulest shorthand to get at the particular method that I'm then using to interpret magic theurgy as in alignment with this kind of trajectory. Crowley often talks about magic as a kind of therapy or psychoanalysis. And so again, I'm using Lacan as a way to kind of return to Freud in a similar way that Crowley is also trying to return to Freud as a point where you can critique these kind of Christian patriarchal norms that still control our society and try to liberate ourselves from them.
It seems like so much of that is kind of built into Crowley's mysticism, right? The idea that it's a little bit of an exposure therapy almost, where you're the whole metaphor of the star passing through the body of Nuit and having these, assimilating these experiences that you consider to be opposite to what you think of yourself, but then you actually have to, go through that yourself. So it just seems like
tear away the veils of the self, and discover that it. And then the idea is, you'll get to the true self behind that. Well, not quite. There's actually two phases to this. As you're going up the tree of life, you get to Tiferet, where you have a kind of knowledge and conversation with the holy guardian angel,
like,
which is the true self you think. But then that's also an illusion, as you discover behind that is ultimately just the Kabbalistic zero, which is a kind of free openness that you can define yourself however you will.
I think Crowley taking the name Nemo, no one, after that experience of crossing the abyss. So it's helpful when you're starting out to posit the self that you're trying to achieve as a positive
entity, because that gets the ball rolling, that gets you started. You get to have specific definitions, and so it's useful to have the idea of the angel initially as if it's a positive being,
Right.
that you're aiming to achieve some kind of spiritualistic communion with. But the ideal of Crowley's magic is that at a certain point, your attainment will get to a certain point where, again, skepticism will begin sooner or later to also dissolve that experience into a kind of deeper kind of negative theological openness, that actually increases your freedom. Or it can lead to psychosis and psychological disintegration, which is why, again, it's useful to start with positing the Holy Guardian Angel as a positive being, because that you begin with an ideal of psychological integration. And then when you kind of know who you are and what you're doing, then when you discover that there's this kind of radical openness underneath that, you're not going to go crazy. If you just start by completely dissolving your sense of self, that can lead to psychosis or reintegration in a false sense of self that's too limited, but then you think you're enlightened, but really you're just you've really reintegrated into a sense of self that's still too limited. So again, it's useful to kind of stage this out. Lots of people like to treat Thelema as a kind of sudden enlightenment path. You can do that. But I find that from my point of view, the results that you get from that are often too superficial, or it kind of fizzles out. And so it's more useful to me to kind of set up a staged progression where, it could be different for every person, but you want to give yourself some goals to achieve that you're going to take some time and effort to get to, and then do something else beyond that, and then something else beyond that. And then as you're going, the Kabbalistic zero will gradually assert itself on its own dynamic. You don't even really have to worry about it. And so this need that people feel, oh, I'm going to cross the abyss immediately, I'm going to do this, that, or the other thing and achieve super. I say, don't worry about that. Let that take care of itself. Instead, give yourself a more constructive, positive goal based on the immediate sense of self that it's all well and good to say to yourself that your immediate sense of self is an illusion. You have to get to a point where you can actually experience that in a meaningful way. And that's going to require some effort. That's going to require some time. That's going to require some practice. And so give yourself some practices to do. Take some time to stage it out to get to wherever it is you think you want to go. And be open to the plan changing as you go. Because as you grow, you're going to develop more complex and sophisticated goals for yourself that maybe aren't going to be what you think your great magical goal is when you're 20 and you're just starting out, or whatever your age is. And 10 years down the line, you're going to have more complex things that you want to do that are going to maybe be a little bit different. So again, you may very quickly through magical practice have very deep experiences of certain types of attainment, or whatever you want to call them. Just like in Zen practice, you may very quickly have certain experiences of satori or enlightenment. But you've got to stick with it. You've got to work to deepen those experiences. And if you shortcut too quickly, you're not going to be able to get the full benefit out of your practice. So this is also a criticism that I have. If I wanted to have a sort of criticism towards the conservative interpretation of Thelema, I would say to a lot of the white, male, bourgeois, heterosexual people who have this interpretation, I would say you're limiting yourself too quickly when you come to Thelema and you say, oh, this affirms my already existing conservative ideology of what I think the world is supposed to be based on my pre-existing class or assumptions. I want to say to them, okay, if you want to have a libertarian, quote unquote, interpretation of Thelema, great, that's fine as a starting point, but let yourself be open to the diversity of the world around you and the experiences that you're having. If you're this Hadith point within the body of Nuit, the great star universe, let yourself experience that larger universe. Be open to the diversity that surrounds you and your ability to unite or come into communication with these other levels or orders of being that are maybe not going to be on the same page as you are now.
Mm-hmm.
And you might be able to encounter or be able to then experience, maybe not directly, but at least some sense of what people who don't have the advantages or privileges that you have, what their experience is like, and you'll grow. And maybe you'll start to think, well, maybe there's this bigger world, this bigger conversation that I could be part of that's maybe not just the, kind of talk that I grew up in. I can, have this encounter with this larger world. And if you do that, I grew up in the white suburbs in the era of Reagan, where it was a very conservative context. And it was very important for me to go to college in Berkeley and expose myself to a more diverse set of discourses around me. And then you start reading stuff that you didn't think you were going to read. And then you start saying, hey, I'm reading this book of, socialist philosophy, or I'm reading Marx, or I'm reading Freud, or whatever. And actually this is saying something to me.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe if I, try to start thinking in terms of this methodology a little bit and start applying it and learn how to see how it works, and then suddenly discover, hey, these are actually really good methodologies for trying to understand history or society or whatever. And the idea that if you're, if you start reading Marx, you're going to turn into some kind of Stalinist, that you're murdering people in alleys or something like that, that isn't really true. And in fact, maybe the historical narrative we have about the Soviet Union, maybe that isn't so true either. And then you start reading some history and you realize that it's a much more complex picture over in the Eastern Bloc or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And that there was all this other stuff going on. And it's not the narrative that you were told by conservatives is just, there's X called communism and it's evil and we have to fight it. And you realize, no, it stands for this whole more diverse set of, complex circumstances. And maybe it's actually saying something to me. And, that doesn't mean I'm going to then turn into, great comrade leader Stalin or whatever. No, maybe he actually stays the bad guy. And you realize, he was crushing this much more complex, interesting historical movement that was going on. And it was really bad what he did, because there was a lot of interesting stuff that was going on, say, in the early 1920s in the Soviet Union in terms of linguistics or philosophy or literature or social activism or so forth. And that all got suppressed by this military dictatorship that actually didn't have to happen. And then you see, then you're part of this broader conversation, or you can go over to Fox News and, get re-brainwashed back into this really lowest common denominator kind of white resentment-based discourse that I think is really gross and limiting. But, it is going on. So, it's also part of the diversity of what's happening. We have to, also engage with those kinds of narratives. So again, this is part of the diversity of the body of New Wheat, that we have to get engaged with all these different valences. I also read conservative writers. I like G.K. Chesterton. I like William F. Buckley. I do read these people too. Now, am I primarily identified with their philosophy? No, because I started there, but I outgrew that, and now I'm doing other things. I now primarily identify as a democratic socialist. Okay, but again, everybody's path is going to be a little bit different, but I do think what's important is to get into conversation with a broader bandwidth. And that's going to change you, and that's going to evolve you. And that's great, because that means that you're going to be moving more as you become larger. The possibility of what your true deeper will can be is going to get bigger. And that means you're going to grow.
That's great. It's fascinating to use that as a kind of dialectical practice that's both very practical and seems very healthy, and also, I can see as you were speaking that how it relates to Crowley's kind of language about, being the star passing through the body of New Wheat and uniting with these things you think are opposites, and then realize that then expands your sense of self as you do that. But I feel like not many people tend to think of that in terms of, engaging with writing and politics they don't agree with, I guess, in our modern kind of occult practice.
Look at Crowley's writings and how complex and diverse his reading lists are.
Yeah.
You go to like the appendix in Magic and Theory Practice, there's this reading list. there's a huge ton of stuff in there. It's
Mhm.
not just one viewpoint. There's Taoist stuff there. There's Islamic stuff there. There's a whole bunch of Jewish stuff there.
Mhm.
Crowley is extremely philo-Jewish.
Mhm. Yeah.
In fact, in the 1930s, a lot of the traditionalists were, and some of the fascist occultists in particular, were very uncomfortable with Crowley because of how comfortable he was with using Jewish Kabbalistic ideas as really kind of a really foundation for his system. I know a whole lot of Jewish Thelemites who really like what he does with Kabbalistic material and find it. My former partner, Carrie Seeline, who's unfortunately passed away, she was Jewish, and she thought that Crowley's approach to Kabbalah allowed her to practice her Judaism in a kind of new and interesting way that she had difficulty in a more traditional Jewish community context, particularly with a lot of more conservative Zionistic elements or certain types of orthodoxy that were kind of limiting what she could do as a woman in those contexts. And she found, Thelema very valuable as a way to kind of express her own Judaism. So does that mean that Crowley didn't sometimes express anti-Semitism? Yes, he did. But that doesn't mean that there aren't these other philo-Judaic parts of his system that it's all about what your hermeneutics is. What are the questions you're asking so that the things that are of use to you are going to light up in the text that you're looking at. And then what's valuable, you're going to use that. And what isn't valuable, that's historically contingent, that isn't important, that's going to sort of drop away and not distract you. So again, it's all how you read. And so we have to choose how we're reading and not get distracted when people come along and say, oh, you have to read this way. And we control how you're going to read. I resist it when libertarian Thelemites come along and say, oh, but Thelema is it's the natural interpretation to have, that it's libertarian. I utterly deny that. I think that the Book of the Law is radically hermeneutically open. There is no natural interpretation. Every person has a unique relationship to reality that will have a unique interpretation of that and all other magical and other texts. And so you can't come along and say, oh, it naturally has a libertarian interpretation. Oh, it naturally has a socialist interpretation. I think that a socialist interpretation of Thelema is valuable historically in the current historical context. But that's because I use a Marxist historicism that doesn't see categories as absolute or natural. It sees all categories as historically contingent that apply to a particular moment in the class struggle. And so the meaning of what communism or socialism isn't an absolute natural category. There is no ultimate meaning in these categories. They're radically defined by the given historical parameters of the class struggle. Socialism doesn't mean the same to us now as it does for the proletariat in another historical context. What socialism is exclusively defined by what the historical praxis of the proletariat is. That's what socialism is. So that's what it is for me in a post-Soviet, postmodern context. And since I don't own a company, since I have to work for my living, I'm a proletariat. Now I'm sort of have certain property ownership in my family that I derive a little bit of benefit from. So I'm petit bourgeois, but that's still a kind of working class. So, it's more complex than that. But that's why I find these particular categories particularly meaningful now in a context of globalized capitalism where we're more and more finding our social opportunities restricted by what's going on in consumer consensus reality. And so I need these socialist categories to be able to critique that. If that were to radically change, then the meaning of those categories would change and would be in another new moment of philosophy. But that hasn't happened yet. So I'm where I am historically at this moment, and I need to use the particular moments of philosophy to get there, to get to where I want to get to. Anyway, that's what I had to say on that. We're getting there, I think, about the hour and a half mark. So I don't know if you have any more questions that you want to ask me.
Oh yeah, I guess there's one that's pretty important because you made a video about it, and really a question for both of you as well, Nick, if you have some thoughts after Dr. Bjorge, which is in what sense is Thelema Gnostic? And that's a pretty good question for a channel called Talk Gnosis.
Nick, if you want to say something about first, and then I'll segue off of that.
Sure. So I guess for me, there's a few ways to approach that, but recently for me, one of the more useful pieces in Thelema that has been part of my own work is this idea of Choronzin. So I feel like there's multiple ways of talking about Thelema as Gnostic in terms of, individual experience, in terms of, intuition and all these other pieces. But for me now, Choronzin and the concept of that being expanded beyond kind of, just an initiatory experience, but actually more of a demiurgic understanding of kind of similar to what you're saying, Doctor, in terms of the consensus reality and kind of the fixed ideas and ideology that we've internalized that have kind of alienated us in this contemporary kind of globalized capitalist culture. That Choronzin is kind of this demiurgic creator figure and a good kind of symbol to be used to kind of explain some of those concepts and to start to deconstruct them. So in my own work recently, that's been kind of one of the ways I've been engaging with some of the Thelemic symbols and concepts as Gnostic. And not so less so about anything to do with Thelema and ancient Gnosticism or kind of the debate about Gnosticism, but some of this idea of Gnosticism as a kind of its own kind of critical theory that's used to kind of start to deconstruct some of these concepts and identities that we think are fixed or essential but aren't. So that maybe that's just confusing the issue more, but for me that's actually been one of the ways I've thought of Thelema as Gnostic recently.
Sure. Well, first of all, Gnosis is another one of these terms like hermeneutics or dialectic that sounds like a complicated philosophical term, but actually is a very simple term. Hermeneutics just means interpretation. Dialectics just means linguistic discourse, talking. Gnosis just means knowledge. It means that you know something. You have some procedure that you're able to learn or know something. So in a spiritual sense, it means that you have some knowledge about yourself. Mm-hmm. So in a Thelemic context, what you're trying to do is achieve gnosis or knowledge of your true will. In other words, your optimal self that you can be, your optimal potential for being, and how that can be best expressed. Mm-hmm. And so you're trying to be it's kind of like the Nietzschean ideal of creative self-making. If ultimately there's only will to power, there's only interpretation. If we exist in freedom, then, and we are what we make ourselves of, then that becomes the project, to make ourselves into something that's going to be interesting rather than dumb and dull and vulgar. Mm-hmm. So this is sort of the primary magical project, as you were. The symbolism of Choronzon is that reality is ungrounded, open, and free. And the ultimate meaning of Choronzon, I think, is ambiguous. It's not necessarily a figure of good or of evil or whatever. It's an obstacle to the magician, at least initially, because the ungrounded nature of reality means that we initially experience it as a kind of chaos that's oppositional. Mm-hmm. But as we gain in knowledge, we can use the open freedom of reality to our advantage. We can negate the negation of the given conditions that we find ourselves in. And so the quality of the abyss becomes something that we can use rather than being limited by. Mm-hmm. And this is ultimately the function of the master of the temple. The temple is the universe. They're the master of their own magical universe, meaning they've passed the abyss, but also in a way they've been dissolved in it. So the idea is that if you think that you're an abiding permanent self, that experience won't survive the experience of the abyss, or it'll be corrupted. It won't be able to, you won't be able to manifest yourself adequately. But if you give up on that idea, if you're open to your ultimate nature being the Kabbalistic zero, if you're the Kabbalistic zero, then the abyss can't harm you because you pass through it. Because you're nothing, you're no one. And so to the extent that you can have that understanding, Bina is understanding, right? And then Hokma is the wisdom of that understanding. To the extent that you can make that knowledge meaningful in your life, in your magical experience, that can be a powerful tool for gnosis. But that's up to you. That's up to the particular magician to figure out, in accord with the particular trajectory of their true will, how that's going to work. And that's going to be unique for every point event of reality. No two persons are going to have the same expression of that gnosis.
And that seems to that does seem to have a similarity with some of the ancient Gnostic myths in terms of the demiurge, or that figure for kind of claiming, you know, I am I, or that this reality is the true reality, as opposed to kind of deconstructing those veils. So those archons kind of keeping you at those levels, as opposed to.
I would say that there's maybe two useful traditional definitions of Gnosticism in a classical ancient sense. This comes from Juan Culiano in his book, The Tree of Gnosis, which is a great text to look at for Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a whole bunch of different things in ancient times, and Culiano has a semiotic structuralist reading of that, where he says, rather than seeing Gnosticism as having some essential thing that makes these things all the same, let's see it instead as a set of family resemblances, where things that are actually complex and diverse overlap in different ways with each other. And so you have this kind of constellation of related discourse systems. So there's two in particular features of Gnostic discourse systems in ancient times, one of which is useful for modern Gnosticism and the other one of which isn't useful. The one that isn't useful is radical dualism. The idea that material phenomenality is evil, and that you have to, that you're a supernatural soul that needs to escape from that context. I think this idea is no longer useful for us in modernity. So modern versions of Gnosticism are going to tend to not share that family resemblance with ancient Gnosticism. Now, there's another feature of Gnosticism, another family resemblance that is more useful. And this is what Juan Culiano calls radical anthropocentrism. And it's the idea that because human beings have a spark of the pleroma in them, that human existence is radically primary and supersedes natural conditions. This, I think, is an idea of human freedom that makes ancient Gnosticism different from other, it has an antinomian element that makes it different from other forms of Platonic or other forms of ancient spirituality, which tend to affirm natural hierarchy. Gnosticism tends to see natural hierarchies as limiting or restricting or bad, that human essence transcends or is greater than those natural hierarchies. That's a useful idea for modern Gnosticism, is to have the idea that human freedom transcends the given ideological order that we find ourselves in. That's a Gnostic idea, and that's a modern Gnostic idea, and that is an idea that links modern Gnosticism with ancient Gnosticism. Certain types of, you could call it antinomianism. And again, links Thelemic Gnosticism with certain types of modern radicalism that would not be compatible with the conservative libertarian reading of Thelema, that would want to see it as more conforming with organic hierarchicalism. In this sense, the kind of organicism of someone like Julius Evola is radically anti-Gnostic in a way that Thelema is a kind of Gnosticism that pushes back against that kind of fascistic Gnosticism. Gnosticism can be radical and liberative, or it can also be a kind of fascism. And so it depends which version that you're. Crowley fundamentally turned against fascism when he was kicked out of Italy by Mussolini. And so he really commits Thelema to being Antifa after that. And I think it's important to tap in again to that valency of Crowley's understanding of the philosophy of Thelema. And as neo-fascistic politics becomes more assertive in our current political context.
Mm-hmm.
The Antifa element of Thelemic Gnosticism, its antinomian element, the way that it pushes back against traditional hierarchical organicism of patriarchy or misogyny or transphobia or homophobia or class-based bourgeois contempt for immigrants or migrant communities or that sort of thing, that this type of Thelemic Gnosticism can be a valuable tool to critique those ideologies of the ruling class.
Yeah. Dr. Bjorge, before we let you go, do you have time to talk Gnostic Mass, or should we keep that for the future?
That's enough of a large topic that why don't we even maybe have that as its own follow-up interview or something like that. I'd love to talk more about the Gnostic Mass. There's enough richness in that particular text and ritual that could really form its own conversation. Maybe I would propose that for some kind of future thing. And this might be a good point to stop.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, we would definitely love to have you back, and it's been simply awesome. And I know everybody who has checked out the show, I know I'm talking to you directly now, listener, viewer, I know that you want to know where you can get more of Dr. Bjorge. Dr. Bjorge, just remind us one more time where people can find you and engage in your work and all that good stuff.
Yes, on YouTube, just put in the search, put the words Liberation Theurgy or my name, Nathan Bjorge, Bjorge, into the search button in YouTube, and my page will come up. And if you're on Facebook, take a look at Temple Sophia Babylon Caledonia. Babylon spelled with an A, not a Y. And we have some Gnostic Masses up there that we'd love you to take a look at, and some other material as well.
Fantastic. Nic, do you have any plugs or anything for where people can find you or what have you?
Sure. So I do have a personal blog at thelightinvisible.org. Oh, thank you, Jonathan. So not super active, but hopefully we'll be more soon. So you can find me there.
And also on your website, of course, we'll say your first book is linked up there so people can buy it. And you have lots of interesting blog posts, even if it's out of date. But I've heard that you might have some more time for writing. So
I do, yeah. So hopefully there'll be more writing soon.
Fantastic. So everybody check that out. And for me, mylandmeditation.substack.com. We're quiet for the summer, depending on when this comes out and when you're listening, viewing, whatever. But that's a Sunday morning secular open meditation for everybody. A mix of guided and silent, good for beginners, good for experienced contemplatives. We got a great crowd that comes out. I do it in person, usually in Montreal when there's not a pandemic, but I've been doing it online, and the people who can only join online want me to keep it going, so we're going to set up a camera in the meditation studio. You can come join us for free Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Just sign up for the newsletter at that address, and I send out a weekly schedule. Right now we're not doing anything for the summer, but we will be back in the fall. For Talk Gnosis and Gnostic Wisdom news, as I mentioned at the top of the show, Father Tony is doing more streaming. He's doing more live events, lots of interesting stuff. So check out twitch.tv/Gnostic Wisdom. Father Tony, I think right now on Mondays or Wednesdays, we're going to hammer out a schedule, but if you just go there, you will see for yourself. He is streaming some Gnostic video games and talking Gnosis while he plays, so you can engage with him there. And he's also, as I said, live movies, talks on Gnostic subjects where you can have your say on the topic and what have you. So a lot of great stuff coming out there. Okay, so Dr. Bjorge, thanks so much again. And this is Jonathan Sword signing off. Bye, everybody. Okay, perfect. Well, thanks, Nic.
Oh, thank you.
But yeah, you'll have to come back for Bjorge Part 2.
Yeah.
And as I said, I kind of want to do a round table on Nietzsche. I don't know if that's something that might interest you, but like Nietzsche / occultism, religion, Gnosticism.
Yeah. I think that would be interesting. I felt like there were so many ways into. I think he logged off. There's so many ways into that, and it's really dense. I felt once he started kind of going with it, it was